The Emperor's arrival. The sky above the human colony darkened as something massive appeared from the stars. A shadow stretched across the land, and people raised their eyes in fear and silence. A giant alien flagship slowly descended, its metallic surface reflecting the burning light of the suns. It was not just a ship. It was a floating fortress, a symbol of power and control. The streets filled with whispers and panic as the alien broadcast began. Every screen and speaker crackled with the deep voice of the Emperor. His words rolled like thunder across the cities. "Kneel, humans, and swear loyalty to my throne." His command echoed through every building, every home. No one could escape his voice. It was like a storm invading their minds. Commander Elias stood in the middle of the main square, watching the sky with calm but determined eyes. He was a soldier who had seen many wars. But this was different. This was not just a battle for land. This was a battle for the spirit of his people. Alien soldiers in shining armor marched into the streets, their steps in perfect rhythm, their faces cold and distant. They carried strange weapons that hummed with deadly energy. In front of the city's central monument, the Emperor's elite guards dragged a captured human leader, an old man known for his wisdom and courage. They forced him to kneel as the Emperor's image appeared in the sky like a god watching his subjects. The Emperor's glowing eyes scanned the silent crowd, waiting for the humans to break. But the crowd stood frozen. No one spoke. No one knelt. Their silence was louder than any shout. The Emperor raised his staff, and a wave of energy gathered at its tip, glowing brighter and brighter. He declared that if the humans refused to kneel, he would destroy their city as a lesson to the galaxy. His fleet circled above like vultures waiting for the kill. Mothers held their children tighter. Soldiers tightened their grip on their rifles. But no one moved. Elias took a slow breath. Memories of fallen friends and broken promises flashed through his mind. He had sworn long ago to protect his people no matter the cost. The energy in the Emperor's staff grew unstable, seconds away from wiping out everything. And at that moment, Elias stepped forward. The crowd gasped as he walked through the silent sea of terrified faces. His boots echoed like a drumbeat of defiance. He looked up at the Emperor's image and spoke clearly, his voice cutting through the noise like a blade. "Take me," he said. "Leave them." The entire square fell silent. Even the alien guards paused. The Emperor tilted his head with interest. For the first time, something unexpected had happened. One human had stepped forward, not to kneel but to offer himself. No one yet understood the full weight of his decision. But that single step would change the fate of both humanity and the Empire forever. The Emperor had demanded loyalty, but Elias was about to give him something far more dangerous, a sacrifice that would ignite a storm, the test of loyalty. The alien flagship soared through the upper atmosphere like a silent predator, its dark structure blocking out the stars as it rose higher and higher. Commander Elias was taken aboard through a massive energy corridor that swallowed him in blinding light. When the light faded, he found himself inside a colossal metallic hall. The air was cold and heavy. Alien guards with flawless armor stood on both sides like statues. Their glowing eyes followed his every step. The walls were carved with strange symbols that told stories of conquest and submission. It was clear that this place was not built to welcome guests. It was built to break them. He was led deeper into the ship until the massive doors of the Emperor's throne chamber opened with a sound like grinding stone. Inside was a circular hall with towering pillars and a glowing throne in the center. The Emperor sat upon it, his presence larger than life. His robes shimmered like liquid night. His eyes burned with power and pride. He stared at Elias not as an equal, but as something to be tested, examined, and conquered. Elias was forced to kneel, but he resisted. Alien guards pushed him down until he was on his knees before the throne. The Emperor raised his hand and silence filled the room. "You have stepped forward," he said in a voice that vibrated through the floor. "Now you will prove your loyalty to me." The words echoed in the chamber like a dark promise. A group of alien officers brought in a group of human colonists, men, women, and children. Their hands were bound, their faces pale with fear. The Emperor's gaze never left Elias as he continued, "I will give you a simple choice. Kneel before me and swear your loyalty, and I will spare them. Refuse, and they will suffer one by one until you understand obedience." The court of aliens murmured in amusement, as if they were watching a game whose outcome was already decided. Elias looked at the terrified faces of his people. His heart burned with anger, but his expression remained calm. He understood that the emperor was not asking for loyalty. He was demanding submission of the human spirit itself. If he kneeled, it would break more than his body. It would break the will of every person watching from the colony below. The emperor raised his hand and gave a signal. One of the alien guards lifted a weapon and fired at the ground near the hostages. The burst of energy made them scream and flinch. The emperor leaned forward. "Do you see how fragile they are?" he whispered. "Your people are weak. Their lives are in your hands. Kneel and they live. Refuse and they will die slowly." Elias slowly rose to his feet. The guards tightened their grip on their weapons, expecting violence, but he did not move to fight. He took a step closer to the emperor and spoke in a firm, steady voice. "Loyalty cannot be forced," he said. "If you want obedience, you will never have loyalty." The court exploded with angry shouts. Alien officers slammed their staffs on the floor, but the emperor raised his hand and the noise stopped. He studied Elias with curious eyes, as if trying to understand something unfamiliar. The emperor then smiled, but it was not a kind smile. It was cold and sharp like a blade. "Then you will face the test of loyalty," he declared. The floor beneath Elias shifted as energy panels opened. Metal pillars rose from the ground, forming a circle around him and the hostages. Strange energy beams connected them like a glowing cage. The emperor explained the cruel test. "Every time you refuse to kneel, the cage will release energy that will cause pain to those you claim to protect. The more you resist, the more they will suffer. Their lives will depend on your submission." Alien courtiers laughed. Convinced that the human would break quickly, the test began. The energy surged through the cage. The hostages screamed as the shock hit them. Elias gritted his teeth, his fists clenched. He wanted to stop it, but he also knew that if he kneeled now, the emperor would own not just him, but the entire colony. His mind raced, searching for a way out. He needed time. He needed to understand the ship's systems. He needed to find a weakness. As the second wave of energy hit, he spoke through the pain. "I will never kneel." His voice echoed through the hall like thunder, surprising even the guards. The emperor leaned back on his throne, intrigued. "Interesting," he said. "Let us see how long your defiance lasts." The cage pulsed again, stronger this time, but amidst the pain, Elias noticed something. The floor beneath the cage had small maintenance panels, likely for the ship's energy systems. His soldier's mind began forming a plan. Every scream, every surge of energy only made his resolve stronger. He was not here to surrender. He was here to fight from within. He realized that his sacrifice on the surface was not the end. It was the beginning of a far more dangerous mission. The alien court watched eagerly, expecting to see him kneel soon. But the emperor's eyes narrowed, sensing something different in this human. There was no fear in Elias's eyes, only a burning fire, the kind of fire that could not be crushed by pain or power. And deep inside the throne chamber something shifted. A small spark of doubt began to stir within those who were watching. Because for the first time, the test of loyalty did not go as planned, and the emperor knew he was not dealing with an ordinary subject. He was facing a storm he had not foreseen. The fire within. The chamber's cold air was thick with tension. As the third surge of energy struck the prisoners, their screams echoed off the metallic walls like haunting music. Alien courtiers whispered excitedly, expecting the human to finally break. But Elias stood tall, sweat dripping down his face, his muscles trembling under the weight of the energy waves. Yet his eyes remained steady, focused, unshaken. He knew that every second he endured was a second gained. He wasn't just standing against the emperor's cruelty. He was studying everything around him. The rhythm of the energy cage, the movement of guards, the hidden patterns in the walls, the hum of the ship's core vibrating through the floor beneath his boots. His soldier's mind absorbed every detail like a battlefield, because to him, this was a war, and no war was ever won by surrendering early. The Emperor leaned forward on his throne, his sharp gaze fixed on Elias. He had seen countless species kneel before him. He had crushed rebellions, broken kings, and turned warriors into loyal slaves. But this human silence under pressure unsettled him. It was not arrogance, it was conviction. Something that burned deep within Elias like a living flame. "You will kneel," the Emperor said in a low growl that carried through the hall. "All who stand before me kneel eventually." But Elias did not answer. He just stared back, and that quiet defiance echoed louder than any scream. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours as the test continued. The alien guards increased the intensity of the shocks, trying to make Elias yield. But instead of kneeling, he began to control his breathing, slow and deep, focusing his mind away from the pain. He remembered the faces of those who had fought beside him in old battles, men and women who had held the line even when defeat seemed certain. He remembered their courage, their final words, their belief that humanity's strength came not from power, but from will. The same will now burned inside him, a steady fire that refused to die. Some alien guards began exchanging uneasy glances. They had never witnessed someone withstand the test for so long. Their loyalty to the Emperor was born out of fear. But what they saw in Elias was different. It was not fear that held him up. It was something they did not fully understand. And that made them uneasy. Even a few alien officers lowered their eyes. Unable to meet his unwavering stare, whispers spread through the chamber like smoke, some calling him foolish, others calling him dangerous, but all agreeing that this was no ordinary human. The Emperor noticed this shift in the air, and it angered him. He slammed his staff against the floor, sending a shockwave through the hall. "Enough!" he roared. "You believe pain will not break you, but everyone has a limit." He turned to his officers and ordered them to bring a new subject. Moments later, two guards dragged in a young woman, her hands tied, her face covered in dirt and tears. It was one of the colony's teachers, someone Elias had seen working with children back on the surface. She looked at him with terrified eyes, silently begging for help. The Emperor pointed at her and said, "For every refusal, one of them will feel what you feel. Let us see how much fire remains when others burn." The cage reconfigured, focusing the next surge on the young woman. Her scream filled the chamber as energy ripped through her. Elias's chest tightened, his fists shook. Every part of him wanted to stop it. But he knew kneeling now would doom thousands. He forced himself to look into her eyes, silently promising that her pain would not be in vain. His voice rose through the noise, firm and steady. "I will not kneel." The chamber fell silent for a moment as his words rang like a bell. Alien courtiers shifted uncomfortably. Some even frowned. They were witnessing something their empire's cruelty had not prepared them for. The Emperor stood up slowly, his tall figure casting a long shadow across the hall. His eyes burned brighter. "Very well," he said. "If pain cannot break you, then time will." He turned to his guards and gave an order in his native tongue. The energy cage powered down, and the prisoners were dragged away. Elias was bound in energy restraints and taken deeper into the ship, down through corridors lit by a dim, pulsating light. Alien prisoners, workers, and soldiers watched as he passed, some with hatred, some with confusion, but a few with quiet respect. Word of the unbroken human had already begun to spread through the ship like a spark carried by wind. He was locked in a narrow holding cell with reinforced walls. The air smelled of metal and ozone. He sat on the cold floor, breathing slowly, feeling the ache in every part of his body. But inside, something had shifted. He realized that his pain had become a message. Even the Emperor's own people had felt it. They had seen a human stand against the might of the Empire and refuse to bend. And whispers had power. Whispers could grow into fire if nurtured correctly. Elias knew now that his mission was no longer only survival. It was to turn that spark into a blaze that the Emperor could not control. As he sat in the dim light, he noticed a small vent near the floor, the faint sound of machinery and footsteps beyond. He closed his eyes and began to think like a soldier again, mapping the corridors, remembering guard shifts, counting the seconds between patrols. His fire had not weakened. It had only grown. Pain had not broken him. It had forged him into something the Emperor had not expected. A living symbol of defiance. Deep inside the alien flagship, far from his people, Elias began to prepare for what would come next. The real war was only beginning. Whispers in the shadows deep within the alien flagship's lower decks. Far away from the throne chamber and the Emperor's watchful eyes, the air grew colder and darker. Endless corridors of steel and humming power conduits stretched like veins through the ship's heart. Commander Elias sat alone in his dimly lit cell, his mind racing through every moment he had experienced since he boarded the vessel. His body ached from the torture, but his spirit burned brighter than ever. He was no longer just a prisoner. He was a soldier behind enemy lines, and every wall, vent, and shadow became a piece of a battlefield he intended to understand. The faint sound of footsteps and mechanical doors reached his ears, and he began to count, mapping the patterns of guard patrols in his head. Slowly building a mental map of the ship's structure, every second was precious, and every observation was a weapon waiting to be used. One night, as the artificial lights dimmed to simulate alien rest cycles, Elias heard a strange noise near the ventilation shaft of his cell. It wasn't the usual hum of machinery. It was softer, almost like breathing. He crawled closer and saw a pair of glowing eyes peering from the shadows. It was a small alien maintenance worker, thin and nervous, with trembling hands clutching a set of tools. The creature didn't speak at first, but its eyes showed curiosity. Elias spoke slowly and calmly, using basic trade language. Asking why it was here, the worker hesitated, then whispered that it had heard about him, the human who refused to kneel. Rumors had spread through the lower decks like wildfire. The guards spoke of him in fear, and some workers whispered about him with a kind of cautious respect. Elias understood at that moment that his defiance had reached places the Emperor could not fully control. Over the next few cycles, the worker returned, sometimes alone, sometimes with others who pretended to fix panels near his cell. They began sharing small details about the ship's structure, energy flows, and guard routines. Elias listened carefully, storing every piece of information like gold. He never forced them. He only spoke with quiet determination, reminding them that tyranny could be challenged. He told them about humans who had stood against overwhelming odds before, about battles where the weak refused to give in to the strong. His simple words carried weight, because they came from someone who had lived through pain without breaking. These stories spread quietly among the lower ranks of workers, and even reached a few low-ranking alien soldiers who had grown tired of the Emperor's cruelty. As days turned into weeks, the shadows of the ship became alive with whispers. Small acts of defiance began to appear. A guard schedule was quietly delayed. A power conduit was rerouted. A surveillance node was temporarily disabled without raising alarms. None of these actions were large enough to be noticed by the Emperor's council, but they gave Elias room to breathe and think. One night, a loose panel near his cell was opened from the inside, and he slipped into the maintenance tunnels. Guided by the small alien worker who had become his secret ally, they moved through narrow shafts that smelled of oil and burnt metal, their movements slow and silent. The alien ship was like a beast with endless organs, but Elias felt strangely at home. He had infiltrated enemy bases before. This time the stakes were simply far greater. They reached an abandoned storage bay deep in the lower decks, hidden behind rusting cargo containers and deactivated drones. Here, Elias found a small group of aliens, workers, engineers, and a few low-ranking soldiers who had gathered in secret. Their eyes reflected the faint emergency lights like a constellation of stars. They spoke in hushed tones, explaining that not all who served the Emperor did so willingly. Some were born into this regime. Others had lost everything to his conquests. Elias listened carefully, never promising victory, but speaking about resistance, unity, and the power of refusing to kneel. His words were not shouted. They were spoken slowly and firmly, each one sinking deep into the hearts of those listening. The resistance inside the ship began to take shape, not through grand speeches but through trust built in silence. Elias worked with them to understand the ship's vulnerabilities. They showed him old blueprints of energy ducts, shield control rooms, and maintenance shafts that the Emperor's council had long forgotten. Every detail was a step toward something larger. Elias emphasized patience and precision. They couldn't rush. A single mistake would bring the Emperor's wrath down on them all, and yet he could feel the fire spreading. A quiet rebellion growing in the dark belly of the Emperor's pride. One night, as they gathered near a broken power relay, Elias placed his hand on the cold metal and spoke softly. "This ship is their fortress," he said. "But every fortress has cracks, and if we strike at the right time, the walls will fall." His voice carried through the shadows, and those who listened felt a spark ignite inside them. The idea that the impossible might not be so impossible after all. The whispers spread further, reaching alien crew members who had never dared question their masters before. Now, when they passed each other in the halls, some exchanged brief glances, subtle signs that they were no longer alone in their thoughts. But the Emperor's ship was alive with eyes and ears, and while Elias's rebellion grew in the shadows, the Emperor's court had begun to notice small irregularities in the ship's operation. The council reported minor delays and unexplained malfunctions, and the Emperor, though outwardly calm, sensed something moving beneath the surface, like a serpent coiling unseen. He ordered tighter patrols and increased surveillance, but he underestimated the power of quiet whispers. He did not realize that his fortress was slowly being mapped and prepared for a strike from within. In the dim light of the storage bay, Elias stood among his new allies, his face tired but his eyes sharp. He knew the moment to act would come, but it had to be perfect. For now, they remained hidden, like embers waiting for wind. The fire within him had spread to others, and the alien ship, once a place of fear, had become a growing hive of resistance. Something was changing in the heart of the Emperor's greatest weapon, and he didn't even know it yet. The Emperor's trap. The silence of the lower decks had become a dangerous kind of comfort. Elias and his growing network of hidden allies moved like ghosts through the ship, planting seeds of rebellion in places where no one had ever dared to speak before. Each day their knowledge of the ship deepened, and each night their resolve hardened. But far above in the Emperor's grand chamber, the air had grown heavy with suspicion. The Council of High Officers gathered before the throne, reporting strange disruptions and minor failures that had no clear source. The Emperor listened in silence, his burning eyes narrowing as his sharp mind pieced together the signs. He knew resistance when he felt it. He had crushed too many uprisings in his reign to mistake the pattern. What unsettled him was that it was happening within his flagship, his most secure domain. He realized then that brute force alone would not be enough to break the human. He needed something sharper, something personal, something that would strike at the core of Elias's unshakable spirit. One cold cycle, as Elias prepared with his allies inside the abandoned storage bay, a sudden alarm echoed through the lower decks. Red lights flashed, and metallic doors began to seal one by one. Alien guards flooded the corridors like a swarm, their footsteps heavy and synchronized. Elias immediately sensed that something had changed. This was not a routine patrol, it was a trap closing in. The small alien worker who had first helped him whispered in panic that the Emperor's forces were searching for someone specific. The rebels scattered into maintenance shafts and dark service tunnels. Moving like water through cracks, Elias stayed calm, signaling everyone to remain silent. He knew panic would expose them faster than the guards could. His soldier instincts took over. Every sound, every movement in the distance became part of the battlefield in his mind. Without warning, his cell door opened remotely, and a squad of elite guards entered, their armor glowing faintly, their weapons charged and ready. Elias did not resist when they bound his arms in energy restraints. He looked into their cold eyes and knew this was not a random capture. They were taking him somewhere important. The corridors grew brighter as they ascended through layers of the ship until they reached the Emperor's throne chamber. The towering doors opened with a hiss, revealing the Emperor seated on his massive throne. Surrounded by his council and hundreds of watching eyes, the air was heavy with expectation. This was not a private interrogation. This was a spectacle. The Emperor's voice filled the chamber, smooth and cold like flowing steel. "You have become a spark in the shadows," he said. "But sparks are easy to crush when exposed to the wind," he gestured, and the guards dragged in a figure from the opposite side. A young woman, bound and bruised, her face pale but familiar. Elias's breath caught in his chest. It was his sister, Sarah, who had vanished during the invasion of the colony. He had feared she was lost forever. Now she stood trembling under the cruel grip of the Emperor's guards. The crowd murmured as the Emperor rose slowly from his throne, descending the steps like a predator. "You refuse to kneel for your people. You refuse to kneel for yourself," he said, his eyes glowing brighter. "Let us see if you will refuse to kneel for blood." Elias's heart pounded like a war drum. Memories of their childhood flashed through his mind. The times he had promised to protect her no matter what. The times they had stood side by side during the early attacks. She looked at him with tear-filled eyes, not begging, but silently believing he would find a way. The Emperor raised his staff, and energy crackled through the air. "Kneel," he commanded, "and she lives. Refuse, and she dies before your eyes." The entire court leaned forward, waiting to witness the breaking of the unbroken human. The test of loyalty had failed. The torture had failed. But family was a weapon few could endure. The Emperor knew this trap was not just about power, it was about striking at the core of what made humans dangerous. Their love, their bonds, their willingness to sacrifice everything for each other. Elias's mind raced, every part of him screamed to protect her. But kneeling now would destroy everything they had built. The rebellion inside the ship would be crushed before it ever had a chance to strike. Thousands of lives depended on his next move. His allies in the shadows waited, watching through hidden vents and relay feeds, their entire hope balanced on this moment. His sister stood still, her eyes meeting his, and in that silent exchange, he understood her answer. She didn't want him to kneel. She wanted him to fight, even if it meant losing everything. That shared resolve filled him with a strength that shook even the Emperor's steady gaze. Slowly, Elias dropped to one knee. The chamber erupted in whispers, some in triumph, others in shock. The Emperor's lips curled into a cruel smile, believing victory was his, but as Elias lowered his head, he subtly pressed the small hidden device embedded in his wrist restraint, a device secretly placed there by the rebels days earlier. A surge of coded signals shot through the ship's internal systems like invisible lightning. Hidden doors unlocked. Energy grids flickered. Security protocols glitched for a fraction of a second. But that fraction was all his allies needed. Deep in the lower decks, systems began shutting down, power nodes overloaded, and control rooms descended into chaos. The Emperor did not notice immediately, his attention fixed on the image of the kneeling human. His voice boomed. "You see," he declared to his court, "even the strongest can be made to bend." But then the lights flickered, and the hum of the throne room changed. A ripple of confusion passed through the guards. The Emperor turned sharply, sensing something wrong. His glowing eyes narrowed as he realized too late that this was not submission. It was strategy. Elias raised his head slowly, meeting the Emperor's gaze with a defiant smile. "I don't kneel," he said quietly. "I fight." The chamber exploded into chaos. Alarms blared as explosions echoed from the lower decks. The Emperor roared in fury as his perfect trap began to unravel. The rebellion hidden in the shadows had struck at last, not with brute force but with precision. Elias stood tall again, the energy restraints failing as systems crashed. His sister was pulled back by allied infiltrators from a maintenance shaft. Everything the Emperor had built inside his fortress was beginning to fracture from within. The trap meant to break Elias had become the spark of the greatest uprising the flagship had ever seen. And the Emperor, for the first time in centuries, felt a chill of uncertainty crawl through his throne room. The ultimate sacrifice. The throne chamber was consumed by chaos. Alarms wailed through the vast metallic corridors. Lights flickered like dying stars, and the alien flagship, once a symbol of absolute control, began to tremble under the weight of the rebellion unfolding within its core. Elias stood tall in the center of the chamber, the broken restraints hanging from his wrists like shattered chains. His sister had been pulled to safety through a hidden maintenance shaft by the resistance fighters who had been waiting for this exact moment. Alien guards shouted in confusion as system after system began to fail. Automated doors slammed shut unexpectedly. Power grids overloaded, and hidden corridors opened where none should have existed. For years, this ship had been the Emperor's fortress, but now it had become a battlefield that no longer obeyed him completely. The Emperor roared in fury, his voice echoing like thunder through the chamber. He raised his staff and unleashed a wave of energy, sending guards and rebels alike flying backward. The sheer force of his power cracked the floor beneath his throne. His glowing eyes locked on Elias with deadly intent. "You think you can destroy me from within," he growled. "I have crushed empires far greater than yours." But Elias didn't flinch. His eyes burned with a calm determination that the Emperor could not understand. This was not a battle for victory in the usual sense. It was a battle to break the spine of a tyrant's power. Elias knew they could not overpower the Emperor through strength alone, but they could destroy his greatest weapon, his flagship, and in doing so, shatter his control over the surrounding fleet. Through hidden communicators embedded in their stolen equipment, Elias gave the signal deep within the lower decks. Rebel engineers and sympathetic alien workers had already reached the ship's primary energy reactor, a monstrous core of swirling blue plasma that powered everything from the shields to the weapons and the throne chamber itself. Sabotage charges had been planted around the control relays, but the system's security was complex and could only be overridden manually from within the core chamber. They needed someone who could bypass military protocols and hold off the ship's countermeasures long enough for the detonation sequence to lock in. Elias knew what had to be done, and he didn't hesitate. He sprinted through the collapsing corridors, dodging panicked soldiers and falling debris. His footsteps echoed like a war drum as the Emperor's voice thundered through the comms, commanding his forces to capture the human alive. Elias reached the reactor chamber, a massive cylindrical room filled with blinding light and deafening hums. The energy core pulsed like a living heart. The sabotage team turned to him with wide eyes. They had set everything but didn't have the strength or time to hold the sequence manually. "We can't do it remotely," one of the alien engineers shouted over the roar of the plasma. "The countermeasures will shut it down if no one stays behind." Elias didn't hesitate for a second. He understood the cost before anyone could say it. His mind flashed through memories of his sister's face, the colony's burning sky, and the moment he had stepped forward in the square to face the Emperor. His entire journey had led to this choice. He placed his hands on the control terminal, overriding the safety protocols with calm precision. The system responded with resistance, fighting to maintain its programmed loyalty to the Emperor. Alarms intensified, and defense turrets unfolded from the walls. Firing at anything that moved, Elias shouted for the others to escape through the maintenance shafts. They hesitated for a moment, realizing what he intended to do, but his sharp voice cut through their fear. "Go," he commanded. "This is where I stand." They obeyed reluctantly, disappearing into the shadows as the reactor room became his final battlefield. The heat from the core burned against his skin. Sweat ran down his face, but his fingers moved steadily across the terminal, overriding code after code, forcing the ship's heart to beat against itself. Meanwhile, in the throne chamber, the Emperor sensed what was happening through the ship's neural link. His eyes widened in rage as he felt the pulse of his vessel shifting, his connection to the systems flickering like a dying flame. "He's in the core," he shouted. "Stop him!" But it was too late. The rebels had sealed off critical passages and rerouted security forces into endless loops. Guided by the maps Elias had memorized weeks earlier, the Emperor's control slipped through his grasp like sand. For the first time in centuries, he felt true fear back in the core. Elias's hands bled from the sharp edges of the control panel. The countdown timer began to appear on the cracked display. The sabotage charges were armed, and the ship had entered a critical state from which there was no return. The terminal's last override required a manual biometric lock that would keep the detonation sequence active even if the Emperor regained control. This lock meant whoever activated it would not be able to leave the room before the blast. Elias stared at the terminal. Breathing deeply, he knew there was no escape, and yet there was no regret. He wasn't just destroying a ship. He was destroying the chains that held his people down. He was giving them a chance to breathe free again. He activated the lock, sealing himself inside the chamber. The walls began to vibrate as energy built to catastrophic levels. Through the comm link, he heard his sister's voice calling for him, telling him to come back, but he smiled faintly, his voice steady. "Tell them," he whispered. "Tell them never to kneel." His final words were carried through the rebel network like a heartbeat, reaching every corner of the ship, echoing through the corridors where soldiers and workers fought side by side against the Emperor's forces. Those words became the spark that pushed them further, harder, refusing to give up even as the ship crumbled around them. The Emperor rushed toward the core chamber, his robes flowing like dark fire. But as he reached the final corridor, a blast door sealed in his face, his own ship turning against him for the first time. He slammed his staff into the metal in rage, energy crackling wildly, but it was useless. Inside, Elias stood before the glowing core, watching the timer reach its final seconds. The chamber filled with a blinding light that swallowed everything. The explosion tore through the flagship like a star being born. A massive shockwave shattered the Emperor's throne, ripped apart the control systems, and sent the surrounding fleet into disarray. Alarms screamed across every channel as pieces of the once invincible fortress fell toward the planet's atmosphere. Elias's sacrifice had turned the heart of the Emperor's empire into its greatest wound, and as the ship split apart, the rebellion within and outside roared like a storm. The ultimate sacrifice had been made, not for power, but for freedom, a legacy of fire. The explosion lit up the darkness of space like a newborn star. A massive wave of light and debris spread outward as the alien flagship split into burning fragments. Its once unbreakable structure now nothing more than glowing shards, drifting through the void. The shockwave rippled across the Emperor's fleet, disabling communication channels, shattering formation lines, and throwing entire squadrons into confusion. Ships collided as their command signals vanished, their leaders shouting into broken comms while alarms wailed in every language. For generations, the Emperor's flagship had been a symbol of absolute power, a reminder to every species of his unchallenged rule. But in one single act of defiance, a human had turned that symbol into a graveyard. On the planet below, the colonists gathered outside their shelters, staring up at the sky in awe as streaks of burning wreckage fell through the atmosphere like fiery rain. Some cried, some whispered prayers, and some simply stood in silence. Unable to comprehend what they were witnessing, they had lived under the shadow of that monstrous ship for so long that it had become part of their fears. And now, for the first time, the sky was clear, free of the dark shape that had loomed above them like a god. Among the crowd stood Sarah, her eyes red from tears, but her expression steady. She held a communicator in her hands, replaying her brother's final words over and over. "Tell them never to kneel." His voice echoed through the night air like a promise carved into the stars. Above, within the scattered remains of the fleet, chaos turned to panic as rebel signals began broadcasting across all frequencies. Workers, prisoners, and soldiers who had long lived under the Emperor's shadow realized what had just happened. The unthinkable had become real. The Emperor's flagship was gone, and with it, the aura of invincibility that had kept so many silent. Whispers became shouts, shouts became chants, and chants became coordinated strikes. Rebellion erupted not only on the ship fragments, but across occupied worlds. Alien workers laid down their tools and raised their fists. Soldiers turned their weapons on their commanders. And oppressed species who had watched the human resistance from afar now saw a fire they could follow. The story of the human who refused to kneel spread through networks faster than any order could suppress it. In the drifting ruins, the Emperor himself survived, his body battered and his once magnificent robes torn by the explosion. He floated among the wreckage, carried by emergency shields. His eyes burned with fury and disbelief. Never in his long reign had anyone dared strike him at the heart of his power. Never had he imagined that a single human, a species he considered weak and temporary, could ignite something so vast. His pride had been his armor, but now it had become his prison. As his fleet struggled to regroup, his commanders waited for orders, but for the first time his voice trembled. His empire had not fallen yet, but a crack had been carved so deep that no amount of force could close it fully again. Across the galaxy, hidden resistance cells awakened as the news reached them. Encrypted transmissions carried Elias's story like a spark riding the wind. Species that had lived in silence began to rise. Banners of rebellion were unfurled in cities that had known nothing but fear for generations. On remote mining colonies, workers painted human symbols of defiance on walls. And on conquered homeworlds, children repeated his words like a chant. "Never kneel!" His sacrifice became more than a moment. It became a legacy, a story that united those who had nothing in common except their shared longing for freedom. On the colony, Sarah stood before the gathered survivors, her voice shaking but growing stronger with each word. She told them what her brother had done, how he had walked into the enemy's heart not as a conqueror, but as a protector, how he had stood against pain, against fear, against power, and refused to kneel. Her words carried across the crowd like a wave. People raised their hands, not in surrender, but in a silent vow. They would rebuild, they would fight, and they would honor the sacrifice that had shattered their chains. In the background, the burning remains of the Emperor's flagship streaked across the night sky like a trail of fire, marking the beginning of something greater than any one person. Time passed, but the story of Elias did not fade. It grew. It evolved. It spread beyond human space. Alien poets recited his final stand. Soldiers whispered his name before battle, and entire worlds began to defy the Emperor's decrees openly. Resistance fleets rose from the edges of known space, their ships carrying symbols of fire and broken chains, their crews united by the memory of the human who gave everything to light the way, even in places where humans had never set foot. His story lived like a beacon, a legend that no propaganda could erase. The Emperor retreated to his inner sanctum, surrounded by what remained of his loyal forces. But even there, whispers reached him, whispers that no punishment or execution could silence. His enemies had multiplied overnight, and more dangerously, his soldiers had begun to question. Doubt spread like cracks through glass. He sat alone on his dark throne, his hands gripping the armrests tightly, realizing that the greatest threat to his empire was no longer armies or weapons. It was a story that had escaped his control, a story carried by billions of voices. And far from the throne, in the quiet corners of the galaxy, around campfires, in dark halls, and inside ships drifting between stars, people repeated a single phrase that had outlived the man who spoke it. "Never kneel." It echoed through time like a song of defiance, reminding everyone that one act of courage could ignite a fire that no empire could extinguish. The legacy of Elias lived not in monuments or medals, but in the hearts of those who chose to stand. And as the galaxy moved toward an uncertain future, his story became the foundation of a movement that would shape generations, a legacy born not of conquest, but of sacrifice and unyielding will.